Hello, my name is Sarah Ronsley, and I am a graduate student certified in human sexuality working on a master's in the field, and we need to talk about that Bigfoot erotica I found under your bed. It is the summer now, which means professionalism has gone out the window, as has most of my voice because I caught COVID last week. However, that means it is now time to talk about the really important topics, like monster porn. What is monster porn, you ask? We've probably engaged in some monster fantasies already without even realizing it. For example, were you Team Edward or Team Jacob? Humans have been thirsting after not quite humans since the beginning of time. And for the purpose of this video, that's how we're defining monster. Not quite human. Anything of the paranormal fantasy realm. The sexual interest in monsters has existed in storytelling before we were even writing these stories down. And they even show up in this niche little book you might have heard of before, the Bible. Nephilim, in some interpretations of the Bible, were the offspring of human and angels. In Jewish folklore, the succubus was either the offspring of Adam's first wife, Lilith, and an archangel, or what Lilith became as a result of her angelic affair. Either way, that makes the succubus both the subject of monster fantasy and also the result of human and not human sexual intercourse. Predating even that, we have Greek myth evolving from oral storytelling traditions from the island of Crete as far back as 3000 BCE, featuring centaurs and minotaurs and gods and demigods turning into trees and animals, and all of them are boning. Jump ahead a few thousand years and we have the original publication of the story of Beauty and the Beast, literally about falling in love with a monster. In a more erotic direction, we have paintings like The Dream of the Fisherman's Wife, a precursor to the tentacle-heavy subgenres of hentai. In the same century, in the West, we have Frankenstein, Carmilla, and Dracula all being released. All also metaphors for the sort of isolation that comes with being an outsider to society, but through that demonstrate the aching desire for connection that is embodied through sex. Jump ahead again to my teenage years and watch Twilight become a global phenomenon 100 years after Dracula was released. While Twilight's monsters were decidedly human, albeit sparkly, the 2000s saw a rise in self-publishing and through that, a rise in erotica on the market in general. And the more erotica put out, the more likely you are to find a market for even the most niche of subgenre of sexual fantasy. Trust me, if you're into it, there is erotica of it. It's out there. It doesn't matter how weird it is. Ice Planet Barbarians, a book series where the sexual interests are giant blue furry aliens with tails and horns who have evolved for female pleasure, was initially self-published in 2015. But it then became so popular that it has been picked up by traditional publishing, who are re-releasing each of the 20-something books in the main series as the author continues to write spin-offs and sub-series that are eaten up. People love it. I've got it. Got the special edition. So we know that people have always been interested in the idea of knocking boots with something more than human. But why? And could you be into it? While monster fucking as a fetish or a kink isn't the most academically studied subject, there is a technical term for this sort of paraphilia. Teratophilia, from the Greek teros, meaning monster, and philia, which is one of the 4 ancient Greek words for love, is defined as a sexual attraction toward monsters or the monstrous. What I find so interesting about Teratophilia is the way that the idea of the monster is defined and redefined through the media produced under this umbrella. As I mentioned earlier, many of the classical monster stories are allegories for the sort of fear and pain and rage and contempt and isolation that comes with being othered by society, made to feel outside of and less than. Through this, we find sympathy for the monster. We all know what it's like to feel othered at some point in our lives. We know what it feels like to want to connect and not be able to. In Mary Shelley's novel, Frankenstein's unnamed monster is never the true villain. Through our connection to the monster, the true monstrosity of his creator is revealed. Throughout history, entire groups of people have been consistently othered, so it makes sense that teratophilia tends to appeal to women, queer people, etc. Christy Overstreet, a psychologist, said the need to be accepted for who you are links otherness with the monstrous. Being different attracts you to others who are seen as different, so there's comfort in being connected with another person that understands. For women specifically, though, a lot of the appeal of the monster fantasy relates to the very real system of patriarchy. While the core sexual desire may be for a masculine counterpart, the restrictive nature of the power imbalances, the history of violence, and the political inequalities related to actual men within the context of a patriarchy can be hard to ignore. To engage with a monster is to engage with otherness. In being unaccepted by society, they can't be a part of the damaging structures of that society. Like I said, there's not a ton of academic literature on why we want to fuck Mothman, but that doesn't mean there's none. In preparing for this video, I read this excellent study by Saraliza Anzaldua, apologies if I'm butchering that name, for National Taiwan University, which I will link below. Here is a quote from that on why we might be moving away from human sexual interest in order to avoid the cognitive dissonance that comes with patriarchy and desire. The problem of eroticizing a species that is literally, through power structures, and symbolically, through language and culture, conflated with 50% of the population that is prone to violence/oppression, seems insurmountable. Teratophilia offers an alternative and allows readers the opportunity to engage the feminine elements of the psyche toward the masculine without relying on normative heterosexual relations. Though it may be masculine, in some cases, the monster is not human, and the problem of humanity aligning with the male is circumvented. Thereby, the female is given latitude for objects of arousal and means of engagement. And in the same way that Frankenstein's monster becomes the sympathetic protagonist while Frankenstein himself is revealed as the true monster, a lot of teratophiliac erotica involve a male human foil to the monster sexual interest who reveals himself to be more monstrous through his actions than the quote-unquote monster. The key of the erotic monster is that the monster always has the power to harm, but unlike their human male counterpart, they choose not to. Through this, the female lead is empowered to release her inhibitions, to engage her sexuality, to take control or relinquish it, depending on her needs, and to embrace her sexual desires. So having discussed the whens and the whys, you might still kind of be wondering about the whats of this, as in, what monsters are we talking about? The thing is, monster erotica runs this massive gamut. So let's look at some of the most popular subjects of the genre. But we're not just going to list them. We're scientists here. We're professionals. I made a graph. Welcome to my fuckable monster chart. Now this is not going to be the most comprehensive or the most stable, clearly. Now this is not going to cover every fuckable monster, right? We'd be here for years if we tried to do that. However, I've got some of the categories I think cover most of the more popular ones within the genre. And we're going to be looking at them on an axis of humanoid to monstrous and mainstream to niche, as in the most human passing, right? To just fully nightmare scenario, right? Like not human at all. And then we have mainstream to niche. Some of these mainstream ones are going to be so mainstream you won't even have registered them as monster fucking fantasies. Whereas some of these, you really got to dig if you want this sort of erotica in your life. Not really that hard, honestly. However, it may take a bit to find what you're into, if what you're into is a little bit further on this end of the spectrum. I had considered doing a third axis for horniness, but one, very subjective, right? And two, I have a creative writing degree. I don't actually know how to make a chart with a third axis on it. So we're just going to go with what we've got here. And our 0 point is going to be humans, right? Can't get much more humanoid than a human. We're going to start right here, where we have sort of a cluster of dots. Clusterfuck, if you will. These are going to be sort of our so mainstream we don't even register them. Very popular monsters. Everything's falling apart. Okay. We had to do some quick engineering to make that a little more stable. But it is on theme. It is being propped up by a Hades and Persephone smut. So we'll get to that in a second. Right. So vampires. Vampires. Werewolves. Thank you, Twilight. And more recently, fairies, with books like A Court of Thorns and Roses and everything else that she's written, becoming very, very popular and mainstream now. These are all sort of in the same category of very human. Vamps, by virtue of their biology, are very humanoid, right? They were humans for the most part and are now undead humans. Werewolves are human most of the month, and then they get a little feral sometimes. But don't we all? We all get a little feral once a month, right? And then fairies, obviously there's a bit of a range. In the popular media, the stuff that has made them more mainstream, they're generally pretty human. Maybe there's some wings, maybe there's some shape-shifting, but they're generally just sexy with pointy ears. So, moving on from there, we have what I've just marked as biblical shit. Now, I don't mean exclusively the Bible, although angels, demons, also very popular when it comes to being the subjects of erotic fantasies. We have Lucifer was very popular. Supernatural, I think, has like 105 seasons or something like that. There was definitely at least one paranormal YA series that involved angels. But I'm also including in this just kind of the whole like pantheon of gods, goddesses, demigods, angels, demons, from whatever cultural or religious background. That includes things like our structurally supportive smut here, which is a retelling of Hades and Persephone. We also have the myth of the succubus and the incubus, the male counterpart, who have been around forever and have been the scapegoat for a lot of wet dreams throughout history. So that is going to stay also in the fairly humanoid, for most interpretations. Generally in a sexy context, we're not talking biblically accurate angels. We're not talking hundreds of eyes or like floating orbs or whatever, although that's out there too, I'm sure. On the note of Greek myth, actually, we're going to move on to this dot, which I've deemed half beasties. These are going to be our centaurs, our minotaurs, our mermaids, these sort of... There's definitely a human part, and then there's also a not-so-human part. This is one of the categories that does sort of lean toward the issue of zoophilia or bestiality. However, the reason that bestiality is inherently wrong is because an animal can never consent. Never, guys. I shouldn't have to tell you that. However, by virtue of being half human as well, these beasties can tell you exactly what they want, and generally, it's you. Now we'll discuss our first range of monster. Aliens are going to cover a pretty wide swath, right? Like, stories about aliens have described them as anything from little green men to our sexy blue giants, as mentioned earlier, or sentient piles of goo. Could be any of the above, which is why we've got a range here. From more on the human side, like our ice planet barbarians, to honestly, it could go further. It could go further, but I liked how neat my chart was looking. On the note of the range of body types that are available in Monster Erotica, it is another way in which Monster Erotica can fulfill desires and fantasies, in that by virtue of it being fiction, the sex can look and feel like anything you can dream up. The sky's the limit when you are writing fictional porn. That's also why the focus of monster fucking as a kink has been on written erotica so far in the video. Written erotica has no constraints when it comes to what it's exploring. The imagination is the only limitation when it comes to writing fiction, and therefore it opens up huge potential for satisfying any curiosity. For example, the barbarians of Ice Planet Barbarians have some additional biology that happens to be really handy when it comes to increasing pleasure. I've mentioned Ice Planet Barbarians a lot, mostly because I think it is a very easy point of access if you are curious about the genre of monster porn, monster erotica, monster fucking, whatever you want to call it. It is actually pretty vanilla, in my opinion. At least the first book, which is the only one I've read. I can't speak for the others. There are like 30 books or something. But in the first book of the series, the Ice Planet Barbarians, the titular first book of the series, once you get over the alienness of it, in every sense of the word, the sex is actually pretty vanilla. It's a lot of missionary, it's a lot of oral, it's a lot of cuddling, it's a lot of monogamy. So if you want kind of a safe entry point, and those are things that you already enjoy, but are looking to spice up a little bit, maybe a good place to start. If you're a little embarrassed about walking around reading a book with a cover like this, although this is the safe for work version of the cover, by the way. The original covers from the e-publications are a little more classic, smutty, novel cover. E-publications are going to be where you're going to find the most in this, the most options within this genre. The next category we're going to touch on is actually down here. Don't want to miss this little dot. This is ghost. Now, ghosts are obviously pretty far on the human side of the spectrum, as in they're just dead people. However, I feel like when it comes to erotica about ghosts, that is a little bit more niche. We tend to use ghosts more in a horror context, although horror and erotica do tend to have quite a bit of overlap. I mean, think about it. The way that your body physically reacts to being scared and the way your body physically reacts to being aroused are very similar. So it is a tool that some creators, authors, artists use. I definitely remember reading a series in middle school that involved a ghost love interest. It was definitely not smutty. The ghost was a gentleman. It's definitely not unheard of. It's we're not going to go too far on the niche side of the spectrum. The next swath we're going to cover is the cryptid category. Cryptids are going to be your Bigfoots, your chupacabras, your Loch Ness monsters, your Jersey Devil, things that are generally the result of urban legend. However, cryptid erotica has seen a bit more mainstream attention due to a slight political scandal involving some Bigfoot erotica specifically. However, cryptid erotica, I think, is one of those that is another good starting point if you are unsure about the genre, in the sense that a lot of cryptid erotica leans into the silliness of the genre. It's sort of like a burlesque show, right? There's a comedy element to it. However, it's still sexy. So if you want to get in touch with the sillier side of your sexuality, goofier side, there's definitely some cryptid erotica that will get you there. However, if you take your sex very seriously, I'm sure there's some very serious cryptid erotica as well. However, it is going to span because, as I said, Bigfoot, right, kind of just big hairy man. Whereas Loch Ness Monster, we're veering into fish? Lizards? Reptiles? I'm not sure. I don't know the taxonomy of the Loch Ness Monster, but decidedly less human than Bigfoot. This dot here is going to be our full beastie category. That's going to be kind of overlapping with cryptids and our next category, but that's going to be things more like dragons or gargoyles or orcs. I was told I could not leave orcs off of this. Apparently, it is a very important subgenre of the monster fucking world. When it comes to orcs and dragons, I imagine popular media has definitely brought some of that back in. Things like Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings. I mean, the Gargoyles cartoon. They were always kind of sexy, weren't they? Like, you can't fault me for saying that. Being less human also makes them a bit more niche. A lot of people aren't willing to really push past the cognitive dissonance that's required for less human monsters. In our last category for today, but like I said, definitely not a fully comprehensive list, we're going to go tentacles. Like I said, tentacles overlaps a bit with beasties and cryptids, I guess. The Kraken is probably under the cryptid category as well. Tentacles also probably overlap with aliens a bit. However, I've put it a little bit further down the list and in its own category because tentacle erotica actually has a very long, interesting history when it comes to erotic art. The painting I mentioned earlier, The Dream of the Fisherman's Wife, is part of a Japanese series of books, which was an erotica style inspired by Chinese erotica, actually. I would love to do a video on erotic art and the history of erotic art in the future. However, that might be a bit of a massive undertaking, so if you have any suggestions on how to narrow that topic down. I did also put tentacles pretty far into the niche zone, but that is a result of my very Western bias, being from America. Because as I said, tentacle erotica has a long history in the East and experienced a massive resurgence in the late 90s, early 2000s due to hentai, anime, manga, which is how it was introduced into the United States as those medias became very popular. The sort of tentacle erotica that is currently popular does stray a bit from the clearly pleasurable experiences occurring in the Dream of the Fisherman's Wife, and tends to lean more toward the violent and non-consensual. That's part of a larger conversation about the increasing violence in pornography. Also, part of a conversation about the use of non-consent fantasies as a coping mechanisms for those who've experienced sexual assault. But that's not what we're talking about right now. We're talking about fucking monsters. And that concludes my ranking of a few of the many, many categories of fuckable monsters. Now that we've tested just how many times I can say fuck in a YouTube video, I would love to hear what monsters you are interested in, which ones you'd love to hear more about, which ones you'd like to crawl out from under your bed in the middle of the night. Please like and subscribe and all of that stuff that you're meant to do. And I will be back soon with some more slightly unhinged content.